Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. My name is Penny Colpin, and we're continuing on with my series on better metaphors and analogies to help describe this process. I was kind of like, which adjective do I throw in there? This messy, this crazy, this transformative, this whatever, that often gets called psychotic. It's often a mystical, spiritual emergence type process. And today's segment, I'm going to focus on mythical analogies or kind of legendary type figures or objects. And before doing so, as always, I am not providing medical advice. I'm just sharing things that I use to equate to my experience related to severe stress breakdown, ego collapse, what was misdiagnosed as bipolar, what could have been diagnosed as schizophrenia had I had that experience about 20 years earlier. And that sucks. I don't know how else to put it. But that's part of why I do what I'm trying to do, is saying we need to reframe this. And this is where when 5 years ago, it was about May of 2020, when I learned that had I gone through my experience about 20 years earlier in the 70s, I could very well have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And that was hard to realize. But it also led me to the work of Joseph Campbell, Stanislav Grof, John Weir Perry, among others, who were trying to understand what this process is, the symbolism, the imagery, the intensity, the process involved. As I mentioned in an earlier video, John Weir Perry's book, The Self in Psychotic Process, that it's a process involved, not an illness, which the whole concept of these are illnesses like diabetes, that is just one metaphor. So here's some others that I think need to be introduced and discussed, and especially when you realize the science was hijacked. I have another video that I've been debating to record outside of, just to get it out there, of how what has been presented to the American public as science is really just advertising and strategy and marketing. So having said that, I'll probably, actually, since this is towards the end of the series, I'll probably end up getting that one out there before this one even gets published. So anyway, and if it is, I'll try and remember to include a link back to it. But anyway, moving on, this is about the mythical figures and stories and such. I'm going to start off with, and there are a lot of them, and actually I should say that this is where Joseph Campbell's work came in with John Weir Perry, Stanislav Grof. Joseph Campbell and Stanislav Grof became good friends in Campbell's book Myths to Live By, which I heartily recommend. I do hope to put a series together on some of these key books and key works that I reference and give maybe a little bit more detail or an overall summary, because I can recommend books all day. And there's so much material in there that what are some of the key points? How do we cull some of that across so much information? But anyway, Joseph Campbell had studied, he was an English professor and studied mythology around the world. And that's where the concept of the hero's journey came from that. But then people like Stanislav Grof and John Weir Perry, they recognized, in fact, in the book, there's a chapter on schizophrenia that Campbell was invited to give a talk at, I believe it was Esalen. And he said about schizophrenia. And Joe Campbell's like, well, what do I know about schizophrenia? I can talk about myth. I can talk about imagery. I can, talk. And it was recognized that mythical imagery or mythical references sometimes showed up, or even often showed up, in these types of experiences, and how that needs to be interpreted for that person's journey. And so what Campbell said is, he said, look, I'm happy to be part of something, but if you could bring in a psychiatrist who could talk more about the schizophrenia side of things. And they brought in John Weir Perry. And so the chapter in that book is basically, it's not exactly a transcript, but it is from that talk with John Weir Perry and Joseph Campbell. So, concept of myth and how people might relate to different mythical figures. So I'm going to start off with just and like I say, this could be, we could talk about virtually any country. We could talk about Eastern mythology, Chinese mythology, Peruvian mythology, African mythology. There's so many out there. I'm just going to present some of the key ones that I can relate to or that people may have heard of, and go from there. But I'm not in any way trying to limit that these are the only myths that can be used. Absolutely not. So let's start just with Greek mythology. On my author page at Mad in America, I had a story that was entitled Trying to Rise Above, that talks about some sequencity, I call it, related to the concept of Icarus. Icarus, basically, that was the guy that he had the wings of wax and tried to fly, and he flew too high. The wings melted, and then he crashed back to Earth, well, actually into the ocean, and drowned. So this idea of trying to attain something too much and reaching, having something that happens and falling and plummeting. There it is. Before I wrote up that article, and actually it was a couple years earlier, I have what the article is about is the song Carry On Wayward Son, which I came to associate to my brother Jeff. Carry on, wayward son. The chorus is, there'll be peace when you are done. Lay your weary head to rest. Don't you cry no more. And the first verse is, once I rose above this noise and confusion just to get a glimpse beyond this illusion. I was soaring ever higher, but I flew too high. And as I looked at those lyrics, I thought, who was that that flew too high and fell and crashed? And then I looked at, oh yeah, that was Icarus. And so when I Googled that, there was an image that showed up alongside it. And I thought, where did I see that image before? Well, Henri Matisse had a piece of art called Icarus. And when I looked at it, I realized that that is the image on the cover of Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. So I had read most of that book at that time, but for me, that's another connection, that I have the symbolism and I have stories related to Icarus. And now here's what I call a lateral link over to Bessel van der Kolk's work. Now, I'm not saying that's overly significant, but it is just part of the wiring and part of the tapestry. Another Greek symbol or mythical figure is that of the phoenix, right? And I really I have not studied Greek mythology, and I've long thought, I watch Jeopardy once in a while, and they'll have the category on Greek mythology, and I'm like, man, I would so bomb at that. You hear about all these people, and these people could answer, oh, that was so and so, and you're like, man, I don't know how you keep all these figures straight in your mind. But that of the phoenix, I actually pulled it up. I know it had to do with rising from the ashes, but the phoenix, I like what it said, is that it's the ability to die in flames and be reborn from the ashes. It represents hope, resilience, and ability to overcome adversity. Boom. I mean, if that isn't what this psychotic process is, I mean, that is so succinct. You die in flames. The burning of the ego, the dross from the ego. I mean, there's so much symbolism in that, and yet it's a reasonable description of the process I went through, especially when I wasn't helped early on in the process and ended up going into much deeper and darker stages of consciousness over the next 4 months, which never should have happened. But given that it happened, it gives me much more knowledge of those other realms, other types of consciousness, that the body, it's still in the body. I've learned how to integrate it. I've learned how to draw strength from it, but that took a lot of work, and a lot of that work was done mostly by me. because too many in the mental health system have no comprehension of all the symbolism and all the imagery involved. I'm not saying they're not there, and I think there are more people learning that, but yeah, at the time, especially more than 20 years ago. So the Phoenix is another one. And then something new emerges from that scree, from that rubble, from that ash that is full of life, moving forward. It's left behind all the garbage. So the Phoenix is one. And of course, I'm sure there's many others in the Greek or Roman mythology. We'll turn now to the medieval mythology, which actually ties in with my second master's degree, was in Germanics. The major field of study was medieval German literature. Yeah, that's one of those really handy degrees, but it was fascinating to study. I read things like the Nibelungenlied, the Parsifal, to Arma Heinrich, stuff like that. But before we start with that, one out of the medieval period is that of King Arthur, which Parsifal is related to King Arthur. But it's basically the search for this Holy Grail, is a quest for spiritual enlightenment and moral purification. It ties in with the symbolism where the Grail is the symbol of divine grace, purity, and spiritual fulfillment. I got that from AI. I searched before I was like, okay, let's just talk about what that quest is and what people were looking for. And so again, this quest for something beyond this physical realm, if you want to talk about it that way. From the medieval German, Parsifal was actually written by Wolfram von Eschenbach in Germany, and that was so I'll take a detour here. That the German poets, the German writers at the time, they kind of had a little feud between the author of Der Arme Heinrich and Parsifal, and one wrote in a very clear, clean, simple language, and the other, Eschenbach, wrote in this overly dramatic and very kind of heavy type of writing. And so even though the message of Parsifal I really appreciate, boy, I talk about having to slog through material. Sorry, Wolfram, but so anyway, but there are the purpose of those stories, and so for people going through this struggle, drawing a parallel between their struggle and some of these mythical figures, whether it's going back to the Greek or going to medieval or going to some other culture, that it can be helpful. One that I related to had to do with something called from the Nibelungenlied, where it's an old epic saga that actually I think it came from like the 6th or 7th century and then was finally written down centuries later. But it involved the story of a young maiden named Kriemhild who had 3 older brothers, which I had 3 older brothers. And basically the whole saga, which is, I don't remember how long it is, but it's quite long. The first half is just all kind of flowery and wonderful. Kriemhild marries this is where like the Siegfried, if you're familiar with Wagnerian, I think I use the German pronunciation, but Wagner, some of those mythic German things. But in the first part, she marries the hero and is all in love and wonderful, and they have their trials and tribulations with other kings and all of that. But then she gets betrayed and someone kills her husband, and she becomes what is called in the book a she-devil. She marries Attila the Hun and exacts her revenge, which no holds barred. And so in that state of this power and this collective shadow material, I felt that power and it wasn't so much about taking revenge on anything, but it was just this sheer power of, I wouldn't even say that I was necessarily betrayed, but it was, I had done what people wanted. I was being a good little girl. I did the best I could, and people just kept heaping more and more expectations on me from multiple sources. And in that state of expansion, it's like back the F off, you know, let me emerge. Okay. Um, Whereas the natural tendency is to try and contain it. And it's like, no, you know, I'm not saying you necessarily let someone just go do whatever the hell they want, but there is a need for, when something explodes, there is a need for that material to expand. And so, yeah, I actually thought of Kriemhild, and I so much so that one of my friends from graduate school, she got her PhD and wrote her dissertation on something related to the Nibelungenlied that I actually went up to the University of Washington library and pulled it out. And I didn't read the whole thing, but I pulled it up. And it struck me that one of the brothers' names was Giselher. I know but the Gisel part I'd learned by talking with a young woman and her daughter, whose daughter was named Giselle. And I complimented her daughter. And she said, you know, and she told me the little girl's name. And she said, you know, I go, oh, what a pretty name. And she said, you know, I really liked it until I learned that it means hostage. And so even this name Giselher, where you have Gisel being the hostage and Herr in German means the Lord of. So there was that name of Lord of the Hostage. And I'm like, I'm nobody's hostage. You know? but so there's those kinds of small pieces, even within a mythic story that a person might be able to relate to. My heritage, by the way, is half German, quarter English, and a quarter Danish. So I'll move on to Norse mythology. And I had not studied the mythology. One of my classes I took had to do with Scandinavian medieval sagas and stuff. But, you know, it's kind of I mean, it was a junior level course, but it was kind of an introductory type course. But what I remembered was this concept of Loki, the trickster, often symbolized by a raven. But as I looked at this concept of Loki, and I thought, well, I can be a trickster too, but in a good way, trying to bring about positive change. And I noticed that if you pronounce it differently, Loki or low key, as in low stress, you know, low, not overly stressed, which, considering I was in the process of releasing all this pent up stress, again, there's one of those underlying connections that I could, you know, I call them quantum connections anymore. And there's other mythical figures. So like for me, a mermaid, having been a synchronized swimming, the concept of a mermaid being underwater, being held underwater, exploring underwater. And in fact, a couple years ago, I came across a quote that says, she is a mermaid, but approach her with caution. Her mind swims at a depth most would drown in. I include that quote in the book. I should say who it's from, if I can see. It's too small. Sorry. But it goes to that idea of living in a different atmosphere, or experiencing something in a completely different atmosphere, and even functioning in it. And of course, that's related to this belly flop into mysticism, belly flop into these mystical waters where mystics learn how to operate in some of these realms of consciousness, but people like me accidentally fall in. And in fact, the mermaid, every now and then I'll come across something that says, always be a mermaid. And I told you I have a number of things, but I came across a couple of years ago something from a thrift store, and it says, always be yourself. Unless you can be a mermaid, then always be a mermaid. Now, I don't expect that to have significance for you, but because that metaphor worked for me, I was like, oh, okay, if I can be a mermaid, go for it, right? That's part of it. Another one that I'd like to mention is those of the Native American myths and the Native American stories. I'm thinking specifically of things like animal spirits and some of the stories of how animal spirits interact. I don't have a specific myth involved that shows my ignorance, but I'm thinking of things like, you know, the symbolism, and actually I should say a lot of myths also tie in with symbols and symbolism. And I do hope to have a separate series on that at some point to pull together. because I think symbols, you can make a symbol out of anything. It doesn't have to be tied to a myth. But Native Americans, that's another one that has mythology around it. The mythology around, say, a bison or a bear or certain stories there. Let's see. And so some people in these processes, they end up seeing specific images or, yeah, mainly images, icons, symbols that they've never seen before. They're not at all familiar with. Might be in a dream, might be in, if they're just noting something, or they might notice patterns where they see the same thing 4 or 5 times in a relatively short period of time. And in some cases, then when people really understand, oh, what is the symbol behind that? What is the myth behind that? What is the meaning behind that? It has deep meaning to the person going through this type of process. And so if they're trying to work with someone, if they feel they need help through this process, which a number of people do, the shock of it is pretty intense. But if they're working with someone who not only doesn't know the symbolism involved, but doesn't even care about it, that's a big problem. That's assuming, oh, everything you're experiencing has no meaning, has no value. Here, we just need to focus on this. That isn't how it goes. And often by taking a look at what is some of the symbolism, what is the material that's coming from either from the subconscious or the collective subconscious that this person is dealing with, can often lead to healing and in a much more effective, much more valuable way than being told you have a lifelong chronic illness for which you have to take drugs the rest of your life. That happens a lot too. And that's the hijacking of science. That's not the actual science underneath it. So in finishing this up, there's one other, I wouldn't say she was a mythological figure, but her name comes up from the Greek mythology, and that is of Penelope. and given that my name is Penny, I thought I'd go ahead and throw that in there. She was the wife of Odysseus, who I consider as one of the kind of big gods. Like I say, I'm not a Greek. You can look all this stuff up. But the name Penny is derived from Penelope, which of course ties back to the Greek. One of the possible theories of the name is it's related to the word weaver. Apparently, there's different legends around that of how each night she would unweave what she had done during the day and I forget what the specific strategy was of why she did that. When I looked it up years ago, the part of the weaver that the name Penelope comes from is bobbin, which, is the part that goes up and down, which to me relates to the whole concept of fighting and floundering in water, right? You're going up and down in the waves and you're being tossed about. Another theory is that the name Penelope comes from the word meaning duck, which also goes back to a myth involving Penelope. For me, that ties in with my love of swimming. It also ties in with my dance class when I was in kindergarten, where we tap danced to Rubber Ducky. And I have long joked that putting a 5-year-old in a duck costume and having her tap dance on stage, you're asking for trouble. And but so you can see, and I say that because I've long joked that I'm still working that out in therapy, which isn't a true statement, but I just say it to be facetious. But again, I'm showing you how how there's underlying threads and tapestries that can lead to deeper meaning for the person involved. One thing, I did look her up a little bit before I started recording this, is that apparently Penelope was the daughter of King Icarius of Sparta and a cousin of Helen of Troy. And then it says she married Odysseus and they had a son. But I noticed this Icarius, which there's an extra I in there, but otherwise, yeah, it's, you make what I call a lateral link. So here's Icarius. That's really close to Icarus, which of course is the first metaphor I mentioned. And I did that intentionally so that I can make a loop between what was discussed here. So just thought I'd throw those out there for hopefully some interest of how mythology and how that, I guess I would say, how it kind of bubbles to the surface or how it becomes conscious, which ties in with what John Ware Perry said. There's an eruption of subconscious material. So these symbols and these myths and the stories behind them have some meaning. And that's what Carl Jung would call this collective unconscious of this pool of material that we all work from. So take it or leave it. I find it interesting. And I know that for some people, these types of tools and this type of approach, just on stuff I've read, has said this helped a person. Stories from Stanislav Grof, that when they realized this symbol came forward and then when they understood what it stood for, it helped that person transform and help that person to the next stage of their process. As always, feel free to like and share. It helps build up the numbers, which, as you know, I wish I didn't have to, but I guess that's where I'm at. And as always, thanks for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.